Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Heard on West Exec, the podcast produced by the American Cornerstone Institute's Executive Branch for America program. I'm Evelyn Lim, your host for today, and I am so pleased to welcome Brad Bishop to the show. Hey, Brad.
Hey, Evelyn. It's great to join you. Thank you so much for having me on today.
Absolutely. Thanks for taking the time. So, as you know, Heard on West Exec talks about what it's like to work in the executive branch. So why don't you tell us what you did in the executive branch?
Yeah, absolutely. So I held a couple of roles. I moved to DC in 2012, right out of college, and worked in the Senate for a little bit and bounced around between conservative think tanks, and then found my way into the executive branch. I would say I was blessed with the opportunity to have that experience. I entered through the Office of Management and Budget as a confidential assistant was my first role, so kind of a policy role as an assistant to one of the PADs who kind of led policy for a certain group of programs at the Office of Management and Budget. Then I was able to move up into the press shop where I was deputy press secretary and then became press secretary, which was really kind of my true passion. That's what my background was in, was communication. So kind of used that initial role as a foot in the door and then became kind of elevated myself into those communications roles. My boss ended up serving a little bit of time in the actual White House, so I went over and also did some work in White House communications, and then was able to move over to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where I was a deputy assistant secretary in the public affairs shop.
So a couple of things to unpack there in that answer. You mentioned OMB, obviously the Office of Management and Budget, which is part of the White House complex, but then you ended up working at the White House itself. How is it different working in the White House versus OMB, which is considered part of the White House?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like I would say, so OMB is actually housed in the Dwight D. Eisenhower Executive Office Building. So right across West Exec, which is in the title of the podcast. So it's right over there. Certainly it's considered as part of the office, one of the offices of the president. I didn't really know much about OMB when I first got there. I mean, everyone had talked about, obviously it's the Office of Management and Budget. So I knew that they dealt with the budget. What I did not know was that it's kind of like the epicenter of the federal government. It's kind of like the nucleus of the federal government. Obviously they handle management issues, keeping the government organized, working on different things in regard to technology, in regard to actual management issues when it comes to personnel. And then obviously the budget, which they handle the president's budget every single year, which is sent to Congress. And then there is also the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA, which plays a large role in the president's regulatory agenda. So it's kind of an all-encompassing office that I didn't know much about before I got there. I wish I would have. I think that would have been very helpful, which is why I think what's happening right now at the American Cornerstone Institute, the Executive Branch for America program, is so helpful because it just kind of establishes these things and gives people a little bit of an idea of what to do before they get there or what to expect even. But it was a little bit different in that it was slower, right? So like budget season obviously is a huge deal. So when you're hitting, I'd say August all the way up until Christmas was always like an absolute blitz for us. And then in the spring, you start kind of redoing things, regearing and getting ready for that budget process. The White House, on the other hand, was always kind of a constant flow of communications work. And a lot of it is reactionary. Certainly there was some proactive communications tactics that we put into place, but a lot of it was reactionary. I mean, yeah, I don't think it's a secret that Donald Trump's presidency received a little bit of media attention, some of it negative, most of it negative. We spent a lot of time responding to those types of things. And the proactive things that we did were to try to inform the American people of the actual good things that administration was doing, which was plenty of them, but they weren't being reported in the press very often. So I would say the biggest difference between the two is we were able to be way more proactive at OMB than we were at the White House. The White House was very reactionary. And that was something I think I enjoyed at OMB that, was kind of lost once I moved over.
And so it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the audience is a little bit different. So at OMB, you're dealing with the budget, which seems that maybe the Hill would have a increased interest in what you're doing. Not that the American people don't, but I think kind of the ins and outs of the budget are things that people don't necessarily know a lot about versus the Hill, who you're working to craft like appropriations bills and things like that. Is
No, I
that
think
right?
that's absolutely correct. I think that the Office of Management and Budget is really, well, who we were communicating to were certainly the Hill. The president has his budget, but that's not the final budget for the American people. We're just trying to get the initiatives that the president holds near and dear to his heart in the budget that Congress will eventually pass. So yes, we're certainly communicating our issues over to the Hill. We're also working very closely with the agencies. The agencies are coming to us. There's a budget process that takes place, and we're working with the communication shops there to make sure we can communicate their budget wants and needs effectively over to the Hill. So yeah, it was more of an internal role, I'd say, than externally facing. But there definitely were times at OMB where it turned external. I mean, when it came to the government shutdown in 2018, OMB played as a very central role in actually shutting the government down and the ins and outs of actually making that happen, which the American people need to be aware of and what's happening. And, we obviously tried to make that process as painless as possible, which was not happening in previous administrations. But that's the role that we took, and just trying to communicate to the American people what's open, what's not, what benefits are available still, what can you do? Here's what the Hill looks like for the next couple of days, how long this is going to possibly last. And you're working with every single agency. You're working with the White House. You're working with the Hill. You're working with as many people as you possibly can to communicate that message. But yes, we talked to a lot more externally facing reporters during that process than we did on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, it seemed. So I was at Homeland Security during that shutdown over right before the Christmas holiday. I think it's still the longest shutdown that the government has had, and I think people don't actually recognize how much work goes into shutting down the government, and also that there are, I guess, I don't know if this is the right term, but kind of carve outs for parts of the government that continue to operate during a shutdown. So I think, do you want to talk a little bit about that coordination that happens? Because OMB is really the center of all of it. I mean, I remember putting together reports about kind of who will be working and who won't be, just based on what was considered essential or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so as I mentioned, it is a process that begins long before the government actually shuts down. They start prepping a couple weeks out, but we're the messengers for this. And as we hear a lot in conversation, I think right now a lot of people talk about a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of misinformation flying around with the government shutdown, and it's coming a lot of times either from the Hill or it's coming from the press itself. And we need to correct things that are inaccurately being reported. And I'd say that's where a lot of our time was spent, that this thing is being shut down or these programs are no longer accessible to the American people. And that's absolutely not true. So we need to make sure that they know that these programs are accessible, that this is what's happening on the Hill. And I think it was a lot of expectation setting, and then just letting people know that, we're working day in and day out to make sure that we can make this as painless as possible, because that's what we needed to be doing.
So you also mentioned the press shop. And so talk to me a little bit about the differences between a communication shop and the press shop, and even kind of public affairs.
Yeah, certainly. So when it comes to OMB, I would say the communication shop and the press shop are kind of one. We're our own separate entity. Obviously, we report to everyone in the White House. We're not everything runs through the normal process that it does. We work for the president. We work for the White House. When it comes to White House communications, when I hopped over there, it's kind of this whole new world. There's White House communications, and then there's White House press. And a lot of people, when they think White House communications, they think of Sarah Sanders and the press secretary and the outwardly facing efforts that are happening. And that is certainly a component of White House communications, but they are two separate entities. There's White House communications, which you can look at to be more of an internally message facing component of the White House, and then there's White House press, who's interacting with the press on a day-to-day basis and answering questions, getting people on TV, making sure that things are lined up and stories are accurate, and answering questions from reporters. That's the White House press's job. I would say White House communications is a lot more aligned with message crafting. This is how we're going to communicate this policy. This is how we're going to communicate this or that different issue that's happening on the Hill. And just making sure that the president's priorities every single day are being implemented both on the Hill and also in the press. So my specific role in White House communications was I was the deputy director of government communications. And what I did was I communicated with the Hill, both the House and the Senate, and made sure that we were all aligned and in kind of sync, and make sure that they knew our priorities at the White House and what we were focusing on that week, and that we knew anything that was coming down the pipeline for them or that was important for them. And just to make sure that constant line of communication is open on the communication side. Now, obviously, there's leg affairs in the White House, and they handle all the policy component of that process. But we were on the communication side to make sure that, if there's any graphics we need to be promoting, or if we have anything that we'd like to be promoting publicly, to hand those down. So that was kind of my role at the White House communication shop. And yeah, I think most people look at it and they're like, oh, Sarah Sanders and press secretary, that's everyone works for them, which certainly, yes, that's like the head honcho, but there are two very separate components that exist within that bigger apparatus.
One of the things that has always fascinated me about communications and really getting that message across to the American people is that you really need to grasp so much policy. So it's not like you are essentially, it's not a one-sided conversation. So there's always kind of communication back, and you need to be able to understand what the policy is. And so how do you prepare for that? Because obviously at the White House, it's a lot of different topics.
Certainly. I always, when I'm talking to people who are, let's say, in college looking to get into communications or getting into press, I always give them this advice. I always say, if I were you, I would go in first in a policy role. When I started out on the Hill, I was a staff assistant, and then I was an intern, then a staff assistant, but then I was an LC, and I worked on healthcare issues and helped our legislative assistant craft healthcare policy for the office that I was in. And I think working in that lead shop gave me a better understanding of how the Hill worked. It gave me a better understanding of how the policy process worked on the Hill. It gave me a better understanding of how to dissect different policy issues that were coming in from other offices or different policy priorities. And while, I wasn't the head honcho, I was able to sit in on these things and learn about them. I would say the same thing for when I went over to the White House. I came in a more of a policy focused role, and I got to see the interagency process take place at the White House. All the different, how an idea came to fruition from step one all the way through to the other, to the end and out the door. And I think that that's super helpful for communications professionals, especially in our line of work, because there's oftentimes so much disagreement between a comm shop and a policy shop. We think very differently, right? Like, I'm thinking about today's problem. I'm thinking about how I can make us look best. I'm thinking about how we can fix, whatever question of a reporter's asking is coming through. Whereas policy shops are thinking, maybe 5, 10 days, 10 months, 10 years down the road, which is where their head should be. And if you can be as synced and as aligned and I think understanding of each other as you can be, it makes the process a lot easier and allows you to work a lot better. It also, as you mentioned, gives you the opportunity to dissect, when you're reading the news, you understand it better. When you're talking about a certain issue, let's say it's disaster assistance, you've worked on disaster assistance, you've seen the process play out. You know how to actually communicate this now because you've actually seen it happen. So I think if I were to give anyone one piece of advice in this podcast, it would be, if you were in communications, either try your best to accept a role in policy, or if you can, do a swap out day with your boss, or swap out week with the policy shop. And then maybe it's even during August recess when there's some downtime. But just try to switch roles just so you guys can better understand each other. I don't think the American people know that there are big disagreements that go on internally between policy shop and a communication shop. And we're not even talking about the lawyers. The lawyers, when they get brought in, then it's a whole nother complex component. But that I think has helped me in my ability to do my job, is that I got that policy experience before I ever even thought about going into communications.
I think that's fascinating. And as a policy person, I also can understand the push and pull of all of these different groups that you're talking about. And yeah, let's not talk about the lawyers, although a lot of them do end up in the policy shop.
Well, as a
um,
communication, I'll take a lot of the blame. We're usually quick to pull the trigger, right? Like we want to get things out the door. We want to get this thing going, and we want it to sound our way. But that's not. It can't always be the case, because that's not. Either that's not how it was actually written, or that's not what the policy reflects, or it's just not quite ready to go yet. So I think if you put yourself in the other person's shoes, which I know is like an age-old adage, but it's kind of the truth. But if you can put yourself in the other person's shoes for a little bit, I really do think it helps calm tension in the office, A, and then B, just allows more work to get done, and makes the office a lot more productive.
I spend a lot of time wordsmithing and get frustrated when people don't understand the wordsmithing is important. but
No, no, it
and
definitely is. And it's
and I
like, and when you talk, we got all these acronyms and all these different programs and all these things flying around. And it's, our job I would say, break it down and make sure that it's digestible to people that aren't in Washington. And, that's difficult to do if you don't actually understand the function of what you're communicating. It's nearly impossible. And I think a lot of people get caught up in, well, I want to go talk to the press right now. And it's like, well, hold on a second. Like, let's just make sure that we have the ability to break down what's happening here, maybe what's going to happen 5 years down the road. And let's be able to talk about this in a holistic way, and not be able to just talk about what's happening right now. I've always found success with that. And I learned that from one of my bosses when I first got to DC, and it's been the best advice that I've gotten so far.
I think yeah, there's a lot to talk about there, but I wanted to go back to something you mentioned, which is the interagency, which it is obviously a word everyone uses in DC. I don't know if people who are not in government even know what the interagency is. Can you talk a little bit about what that is and how that process works from a communication standpoint?
Yeah, certainly. So I'll just go, I guess I'll kind of intertwine all of my components. So I'd say, there's a policy that HUD wants to enact, but it's obviously got to roll through approval process at the White House. It's going to bring in, so HUD will bring in the Office of Management and Budget, it'll bring in the Domestic Policy Council, any other agencies that are going to play a role in this, and everyone plays a process in crafting that. That is the policy process. That same thing goes for communication. If a press release is written, it doesn't just go out the door because OMB wants it to go out the door. It's got to be run by HUD to make sure that they're good with it. It's got to be run by DPC to make sure that they're good with it. It's got to be run by the White House, who has the ultimate sign off, because all of us work for the White House, to make sure that they're good with it. And it just requires a constant line of communication, and make sure that you're staying in touch with these people as much as you can. Which is great. I mean, it allows you to formulate friendships in different areas or different places throughout the administration, and places where you thought you might not. I thought that was one of the best parts about my job, was that I got to work with the agencies, and I got to work with people on the Hill, and got to know new faces and got to know new people. But yeah, I mean, it's just that constant communication of making sure that, it's not just our interests that are being reflected. It's Secretary Carson's over at HUD. It's, President Trump's. And then obviously it's also, whoever's the principal that you're working for at the time. You should make sure that everything's synced up and ready to go, and everyone agrees on the product that's being delivered. Is really on the communication side what I mean by interagency process.
I think it's fascinating to a lot of people to think that perhaps the secretary of a department doesn't have the last say on a policy that would, or even like a communications that directly impacts their agency. How would you explain that to somebody outside of DC?
Yeah. I mean, we're not elected. We're not elected officials, right? When we were at HUD, we're not elected officials. The president of the United States is elected, and he selected our boss to serve in his cabinet. So at the end of the day, his wish is our command, right? Like, we deliver on what he would like to happen, whether we like it or not. Now, certainly, you could say there should be a line of communication. We should be able to have conversations and do things, which we certainly did all the time. But at the end of the day, the wishes of the president should be what the American people selected. I know most people think of that as being a policy outcome, but it also works that way with communications. If a statement isn't crafted how someone would like it to be crafted, then we'll make the necessary tweaks to make it happen. And you always know your boss best, and you always know how to write best for your boss because you're with them every day. And you can certainly go in and advocate for them and make sure that it still reflects their tone and what they want done, but it definitely needs to be signed off from the White House, because those are the people who are calling the shots, and they should be.
For policy issues, I always kind of go back to, I worked at the Department of Homeland Security, and, there are 22 plus agencies there. And if you want to look at something like Customs and Border Protection, it is not just Customs and Border Protection that has kind of authority over the border, right? Or has input on that, because the State Department has some say on our relationships with Mexico and Canada. The intelligence agencies have input on what's happening from an intel perspective. The Department of Justice, they have the law enforcement and the attorneys they're responsible for ensuring that we're following the laws of the nation. And so there's all these other departments and agencies that play some sort of role in this. And so the secretary, even though they're the Secretary of Homeland Security, is not a unilateral force. And when often there are issues among the interagency, it'll be the president who kind of breaks that tie. So, if it's an issue that goes all the way up where the secretaries are not agreeing on something, then the president has to weigh in and say, well, this is where we're going to go. And I think that is something that people don't necessarily understand about the interagency, is that the government is not siloed, and nor should it be. It is very much how the different authorities that Congress gives are spread across different agencies. And a lot of times the relationships that you have with other people in those agencies will be super fruitful to getting your work done.
Yeah, no, certainly. No, I think that everything you just laid out is absolutely correct. The relationships that you're forming, you want to be as helpful as you can to the president, as I mentioned, because Secretary Carson's my boss at HUD, but big boss is the big boss, the president of the United States, right? Like, that's who we're working for. That's who everyone's working for. That is who, as I said, he is elected by the American people. He's calling the shots. And you want to make sure that we're working hand in hand and working effectively with them, which I think this administration did a fantastic job of, the one that I was a part of. I think President Trump's administration was great. I think that I had a wonderful relationship with the White House while I was over at HUD. Certainly helped that I'd worked there before and that I knew a lot of those people, but I'd also met them from OMB. And I think everyone worked really well, but it's because we kept a constant line of communication, which you'd think everyone would be good at in communications, but they're not. A lot of times people just want to pull the trigger and get off what they want to get off and out the door to the press and right away, or message something this way when certainly it would be better messaged in a different way, but you just haven't run it by that agency, the appropriate one. I think we did a really good job of that at HUD. I think we did a great job of that at OMB, and I think we did a great job of that at the White House too. But yeah, no, the government is certainly not siloed. I would agree with you on that. It is not incumbent on one person there to call all the shots, except for the president. That is who calls the shots.
You were also at HUD, as you've mentioned. What are and I know that you were there at the end of the Trump administration. And so you talked a little bit about what I would call a big event, which is shut down, but also another big one that happened during the administration, which is COVID. And the communication with the American people was one of the biggest things I think that the government was doing during that time. Talk a little bit about your time at HUD.
It was the craziest job of all, which really surprised me. If you told me now, hey, you had a job at OMB, you had a job at White House Communications, you had a job at HUD, I would have been like, oh, I kind of retired over to HUD where I could relax and hang out and it'd be, a little bit calmer. It was not the case at all. And, COVID played a large part in that. Dr. Carson, Secretary Carson, was a member of the COVID task force. And that was one of the most, I would say, just eventful, just chaotic times. It was unprecedented. We hadn't dealt with anything like that before. And you're working from home and you're working in the office and you just had the constant lines of communication, both with the White House, with the task force, with everyone at HUD, with, you yourself were out in the field in Colorado, with the folks that were actually out in the country, making sure that our policies were being communicated, and not to mention every other agency that's involved in that process, which was every single agency. It was a lot. I mean, I think we did a really good job of communicating, to our folks that relied on HUD assistance or HUD programs. I think we did a really good job of communicating the needs and the wants. And making sure that they understood what was happening on a day-to-day basis. I think Secretary Carson did a fantastic job and really showed some fantastic leadership in that space. And I think the White House did as well. I mean, it was a time when the news cycle is changing every 5 minutes. And it was not, that's difficult for everyone in a communication space, right? Like we come from the days of, it's transportation week and everyone's focused on one issue for the entire week. That was not the case. It was absolute chaos every day, and it was expected. But I think we did a really good job of handling ourselves.
One of the things that I thought was so important was that, HUD stakeholders include everyone from public housing authorities to nonprofits who are working with homelessness, and other organizations, cities and states, and I think for some of our stakeholders, they were out there without information on how to actually deal with the needs of their constituencies. So, HUD had put together these webinars and huge conversations with stakeholders to talk about, here's what we're hearing from the CDC. Here's how we think you should be dealing with people who can't shelter in their home, who can't stay home. And I think some of those things really get lost when we think about kind of COVID overall. But I do think that things like that really really are the things that show that government was working and that we were thinking about people who the only other news source they would have would be from the media. And that was always all over the place. So
yeah, certainly. I mean, but even from a media perspective, I think our strategy changed, and it's not, in order to communicate, we did hundreds, and I'm talking Secretary Carson did hundreds of interviews in the span from March to, let's say, even through January when we ended up leaving in 2021. Hundreds and hundreds of interviews. And a lot of it's because we started to focus on regional media and local media. Whereas, we did a lot of local media because Dr. Carson traveled a lot. So we were very, used to that. And we had good connections with local reporters and good connections with local outlets. But we would host these massive calls to explain a policy that's coming down, and we would have tons of regional reporters on there. Which I think was able to get our message to where it needed to be. Not everyone's watching CNN or Fox News or reading the Washington Post and the New York Times as much as they would like that to happen. It's not the case. People most of the time interact with their news outlets on a local basis and a local level. And I think we did a great job of getting that down to that level. And Secretary Carson really kind of pushed through and did as many availabilities and interviews as he possibly could, which I think was very effective for us.
I think that really just it's so clear to me just how important communicating. People think about the government as kind of doing a lot of programs and things that affect their lives, but obviously how we communicate that is so important. And so thank you for all of that hard work.
Yeah, no, it was a great time. I was honored to work with so many great people. It really was fantastic. But no, I completely agree. It's like you always see statements pop up. You always see folks on TV. What you don't see is the work behind that. You don't see the communication that's happening with the network. You don't see the conversations that were happening with the reporter in order to make sure that everything was set up and ready to go. You just see the face, and that's the way that it should be. Like that's how we live in an era where a lot of people want to get onto TV and a lot of people want to do things. But at the end of the day, I think this job is a lot about servant leadership. You're there to help your principal excel. And when your principal excels, you're excelling at your job. It's the same thing with policy. It's the same thing with communications. And I know people want to end up on podcasts. I know people want to get Fox News contracts and do all the super cool things that you want to do. But it's also really cool to see your boss succeed and really cool to see some big moments happen. And I've been fortunate enough to work with great people in order to see a lot of those things happen and come to fruition.
So we usually end this podcast with some best advice, but you've already answered that. So why don't you help me by filling in this sentence? You might be a communications professional if you like doing this.
Being on your phone nonstop. I think my wife is eventually going to kill me. She might actually kill me, but you got to be connected at all times. Like you got to be constantly reading the news. You got to be constantly digesting the news, and that unfortunately fortunately and unfortunately, today's world means you're on X, you're on Facebook, you're on Instagram. I mean, it's everywhere. We have so many different ways of digesting news these days that it's not just picking up the paper, reading through it, drinking your coffee, and going to work. It's like you're up in the morning. You have 45 notifications on Twitter from X that have hit that you've pre-selected, and that's just the ones that you've pre-selected. And then you've got 3 podcasts you listen to on the way to work, and then more news is breaking. So I think in today's world, it's finding, if I were to give some advice on that point, it's just finding the channels that are most effective for you. I've found a lot of use out of X. A lot of people don't, but that's where most reporters are. That's where they're breaking the news these days. And find your 3 publications that you like, sift through those, and just make sure you're getting the information that you need, because there's just so much out there that you don't need. But yeah, no, I'd say if you need to be addicted to or at least prepared to be addicted to your phone a little bit.
That's a great answer. And I actually just thought of one more question, so if you'll indulge me.
Yeah.
What would an entry-level job in communications look like? What would they be doing on a
So
day?
once again, I tell everyone to go to the Hill. You should go to the Hill. My ideal entry position for you guys, if you're listening and you're out there and you want to do this, would be to go into an entry-level policy position. So like an LC on the Hill would be great. But if you actually want to dive straight into press, they do have press assistants as well. So there's press assistants, press secretaries, and usually a comms director on the Hill. Those are the 3 big roles. I got in, I'm old, I'm dating myself here, but I got in when social media was rather new. Now there are digital directors as well. And I will say, especially, this is a conservative podcast, it's a conservative organization. In the conservative space, that's a pretty unfilled one. We don't have a lot of digital communications experts on our side. Now it's growing, certainly, and there's more available now than there were, let's say, 3 years ago. But if that's something that you are good at, if you are creative, if you are really good at graphic design or at just creatively thinking outside the box of a way to just digitally show people a message, that I would highly encourage you to go down that path as well, because it's lesser known and it's lesser explored right now. But yeah, no, that press assistant role is really you would say that'd be your first step.
Well, that is great advice. And I actually second that because there's been so many times where I've thought, well, I really need something to illustrate how this works. And I just don't have that skill set.
Yeah,
So,
no, it's tough. Like everyone thinks they're like, oh, well, you snap a photo and then it goes up. Well, no, it goes through an editing process and it goes through. We've got to add text to the photo and you've got to add all these different things. And I'm not capable of doing that. I'm A, not creative enough, but B, I don't know the software or the process. And these kids do, and they are really, really good at it. And that's a fantastic tool to communicate your whatever your shop is doing. And they come up with such creative ways to do it. And if you have that ability, and you are a conservative, I would urge a lot of people to start exploring that. I think there's a lot of opportunity there, and it's something that's really starting to kind of blow up a little bit.
well, great. Thank you. You heard it here first, everyone. Brad Bishop, I'm so happy that you joined us today. Thank you for your time and for your advice. Thanks to everyone listening. This is Heard on the West Exec podcast. You can find us wherever you find your podcasts. Remember to rate and review us. And remember that you heard it here on West Exec.